welcome to the Fretboard Journal podcast. I'm your host, Jason Verlinde. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for your patience. I lost my voice last weekend in Chicago. I finally can talk enough to do another podcast. Next week, we'll be back on track again. First off, I just want to thank everybody who came to the 2024 Fretboard Summit in Chicago. We're going to hear a highlight from last weekend's event on this very episode of the podcast. But to all of you who made the trek, thank you. I know you had a good time. This was our most successful event by every metric imaginable. Number of people, number of sponsors, guitars sold, smiles on people's faces. It truly was this beautiful gathering where there was just so much love and so much joy floating around the two buildings of the Old Town School of Folk Music. You could feel it. It was great. And coolest of all, there were so many people from this podcast who attended, who taught, who played over the course of the weekend. And it was just this beautiful thing to see all of these people under one roof, including some recent guests like Jonathan Stout and Sophia Wolfson, along with these legends of guitar making and the entire spectrum of people that we feature in the magazine and on this show. I could talk about the summit for hours. Maybe that's what our Patreon is for. In the meantime, I just want to share with you this incredibly cool session that went down last Saturday. It was Blake Mills and Joe Henry in conversation. Joe Henry, one of the most erudite people I've ever met. At the very first Fretboard Summit, 2015, he did this incredible interview with David Crosby that is still in our podcast feed. So I asked him to talk to Blake this time around about production, about honoring the song, and everything else they could think of. I hope you enjoy it. I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Seattle's own Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar here in Seattle, Washington. One of the coolest guitar stores around, one of the best repair shops around. Please follow them. Please check them out. Peghead Nation is still offering you all your first month free or $20 off of any annual subscription with the promo code Fretboard. Stringjoy Strings, they were at our Fretboard Summit. They are offering you all 10% off your first order at stringjoy.com with the promo code Fretboard. Isotope wants you to know about the new RX-11, one of the coolest toolkits and repair plugins imaginable if anybody out there is struggling with audio that just has some noise that won't go away. Try it out. Tell them the Fretboard Journal sent you. And our new 55th issue of the Fretboard Journal is going to be just around the corner. We're less than a month away from that mailing to everybody. So subscribe if you haven't yet at fretboardjournal.com. We'll undoubtedly be sharing some of the best photos and stories from the summit in our next few issues. Speaking of which, our next Fretboard Summit is August 21st to 23rd, 2025. So mark those calendars. And again, thank you so much for being a part of the Fretboard Journal community. I hope you enjoy this conversation. This was a good one. They go deep. Good morning. You've all survived day 2 of the Fretboard Summit. I'm Jason from Fretboard Journal. Thank you all for being here. There's not a lot of structure to what you're about to hear, but it is going to be amazing, and hopefully we'll make a great podcast out of it. At the very first Fretboard Summit we ever threw, if this is like a total deep cut, Joe Henry interviewed David Crosby, who graciously chartered a plane and came to the very first one we did in California, which was completely ridiculous. And Joe and Cros talked about If I Could Only Remember My Name and a whole bunch of things about production. And it was just this like magical melding of the minds. So we asked Joe to do that with Blake, because why not? We've got 2 of the most brilliant guitarists and producers here in front of us, and songwriters. So Joe Henry, Blake Mills.
Mm-hmm. So magic seems to be the instruction. I don't know how we can, fully live up to it, but we shall try. Thank you for all dragging out this morning. We appreciate it. I think a natural place to begin is, I recognize that an alliance that we have is that we've both worked with some frequency with artists that are referred to as legacy artists. People who deep into a working life, who we are asked to be in service to and need to find a way to do it without keeping them on the pedestal that they were probably on before we walked into the room to work. So how do you tune your brain for that?
I think one of the coolest things that became evident when I started to find myself in the rooms with some of these people that I'd grown up listening to, and it began with musicians, session musicians. And when we walked in the door today and started talking about Jim Keltner with somebody, that was one of the first people that the wall between this world of music that I listened to religiously and my the people that I was working with every day, that started to come down. And he was one of the first people that I remember having that sort of like, okay, just get your shit together, and like, you know, and to be in the room with them and see the way that they work, which is that they're showing up every day as a newbie. You know, they're as fresh as you are in terms of whatever I have done before may not serve me today, and so I just need to do my best to figure this thing out. And you watch their process and you see that it's so similar to everyone's, you know, your own. And what a wonderful thing to be able to observe, you know, that it's like they're human, you know, is really a trip, because they are responsible for all these things that are so much larger.
But a big part of our evolution. And I had the exact same experience with Jim. I just, T-Bone Burnett had produced a record for me. I was still living in New York, and my wife and I moved to Los Angeles. And T-Bone, for whatever reason, recruited me to be his production associate. And the first session I was on with T, I walk in the room and there's Jim Keltner. And the experience that I remember the first day I was in his presence is I walked into the performance room. The other musicians had not arrived yet. And Jimmy's sitting at the drum kit and he's playing. And it was the first time I was aware of this idea that a drummer alone in a room playing, was complete music. It wasn't somebody waiting for the rest of the rhythm section to show up. And I stood there realizing that this man is just sitting here playing music and it needs nothing else. It's absolutely complete. And if that's true, then how liberating to start thinking about not only how much you can do, but how little you can do and have it still be vibrant. But the important thing about Jim, you know, for me, is that I didn't have to tell him I was having this experience. He witnessed that I was having this experience. And he invited me to sit down next to him. He took this moment for whatever reason. And he just started right in. He said, I never listened to the bass player. It's not like we're not trying to lock up that idea of like, let's solo the kick and the bass. Is like, who gives a fuck? He said, I just listened to the singer. And he said, for instance, this is how John sang. And he played this groove. And I like, but this is how Bob sings. And he shifts this emphasis in the most nuanced way that said everything. You know, where Bob comes from a deep blues tonality, and John Lennon was coming from somewhere else, you know, coming from, you know, early rock and roll, R&B music, Motown. But just in that playing, just that lesson that he gave me about how he follows phrasing of a singer, and that dedication to that person who stands at the center of what we're doing today. And essentially that thing you talk about of how these musicians that we both revere can bring themselves and do back to, you know, what the Buddhists call the beginner's mind, you know, all the time. Reminds me of the short story writer Eudora Welty, to whom I'm devoted, said, every short story you write teaches you how to write that story, but not the next one. And I think that these people we're talking about approach the session the same way. You know, how I find myself in service to the song is me learning how to play the song. And when the next song comes up, I have to be as open to that influence of what's specifically happening right now around me as I could possibly be. And, what a great lesson that translates beyond music,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, that you're reminded constantly that what you know doesn't matter.
Yeah. And how far can we get, from what we know? I think I talked a little bit last night about when a song starts to take shape, as soon as I'm aware of it, that it's happening, my most important job is to protect myself from involvement. I'm just trying to let enough raw fabric spool off that later I can come back in the different mind. John Cage said it's really important that we don't confuse the creative mind with the analytical mind. They both have a function, but they're not the same thing. When you're in creative process, you're just being kind of swept away, But the moment you start evaluating what you're doing and thinking about, is this any good? Do I like it? Will other people like it? You're in the analytical mind. You're in refinement mind, but you're not being swept away by the river anymore. You're up on the bank looking down at it. And I realize that anytime I realize a song is there to be written, I just have to put myself in the posture of people at a seance. You show up with intention, you get the lighting right, that's the most important. And then you let something happen to you. I really don't think of songwriting or record making as something I'm doing. I think of it as something that's happening to me. And that place and the artists that we start talking about, that you've worked with, that you grew up listening to, and I've had that experience. I've been so fortunate to have that experience so many times, and how essential it is to be generous enough, that I think we have to be, to see these artists as humans who are just trying to rub two sticks together that day. They can't be responsible for my reverence for the work they've already done. Otherwise, I can't help them in any possible way. And I don't know if I've ever been in a room with an artist like that who wasn't completely willing to be human, if I was completely willing to see them as human.
Yeah. Yeah, the mythology comes down right away. But we're also lucky enough to be with these people in a creative environment, right? So it's so different from when they might be feeling the responsibility to uphold the mythology of who they are, or if there's a larger audience, like all those variables, that mask, that costume might come up, and when you're working with them on their music, they're at their most vulnerable. Ideally, you see a part of them that's very childlike.
Yeah,
it's a trip.
Yeah, I was talking. I think I said something last night about working with Joan Baez, and as it turns out, I've produced the last recordings of a number of people. I mean, to the point where this little blurb in the New Yorker once referred to me as the Undertaker. I don't know if that's done my career any help, but as it turns out, I've just worked with a lot of people who were, in their winter years, and it was the last recordings they made. 5, 6, 7 times it's happened. But when I was working with Joan, it was the first time, the only time to date, where an artist of that stature said at the onset, this is it for me. I'm buttoning this up and I want to do it in a very deliberate way. So making that record and knowing this was her final album statement, and I watched her struggle on the first day with trying to at least gesture towards the famous high end of her voice that everybody knows her for, which she does not have anymore. And she seemed really dedicated to at least, throwing a rock up at that window, because that's how people know her. That's part of her power and the memory that people carry around of her. But that's not where her power was at that moment. And it's not like I did anything actively to take her anywhere other than the struggle she was in, other than just to be with her and bear witness to it. Because I watched the transformation of her when a song finally came up. It happened to be the song that I sang last night, Civil War. That's the song that she sang, where she abandoned any idea about what her voice was expected to be. And she ended up sounding like those records if you've heard Marlene Dietrich singing. She was like Marlene Dietrich without the accent. She was way down in the weather of her body. And she heard that it was in the character of the song, the character speaking the song. That's what that character sounded like. Mm-hmm. And I remember hearing the take go down and being completely mesmerized by it and waiting for her to walk in the control room. And I said to Ryan Freeland, the engineer, I said, if she doesn't hear that this is great, we're fucked. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know what to do if she doesn't hear this as the direction, because this is where she bodily lives right now. And she came in and sat close enough to me that our knees were touching at that board. And I didn't even want to look at her when we were listening, partly because I was really emotional. I was hearing my song in her voice, and that was not a small thing. And the take ends, and she just kicked my foot under the console and just said, fucking hell, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah, fucking hell. And then we never talked about it again. She was free, but I watched her, and she was willing to be that vulnerable in front of all of us in the room, you know, while she's trying to figure out how to be her authentic self in a way that observed her history, but she wasn't trapped by it. And I think with every so-called legacy artist I've worked with, that's sort of been the whole gag. You know, your history is authentically yours. You're allowed to lean into it, but we don't want to be stuck there because people are going to have expectations because they have all these old records they love. So how do we help, you know, honor your history and at the same time walk away from it? And it's been incredible how many different ways I've witnessed artists that we all love make that choice. And it's always really a vulnerable place to be. To be doing it, first of all, in front of people in a room that maybe they don't really know very well. But always keeping a thought for, well, this is going to leave this room, and how am I going to live up to it if I'm going to live up to it?
Well, it's interesting you say that she had that sense of a responsibility to her former register, her former self, and out of what I imagine is probably coming from at least some place of generosity, wanting to pay homage to that for her audience, maybe also for herself. There's something extremely relatable to any creative person who has had things published or seen, and then years later, there's an audience that has an expectation, however big or small, and how unusual that can be for a certain type of creative person who is satisfied most by the journey of discovering this and then exploring this and not reading the same book over and over and over again, or visiting
absolutely.
the same city.
Yeah.
But when you do also weigh that sense of wanting to be generous to an audience, it's hard sometimes to know what is truthful, what is being honest to yourself as a not just a creative person, but as a person. I think being an example for some of these legacy artists who must be dealing with that on a scale that's unimaginable.
Mm-hmm.
That in your own, way, that like when you play something that's unexpected. And that's really what's so special about all these musicians that we were talking about growing up, listening to the session guys. You didn't know that what they just did was possible or would sound as incredible before they did it.
Right.
Like when you hear it, you go, oh, wow, yeah. Why would anybody ever want it to be anything else?
Yeah.
And to allow yourself to take those risks and not just, when we say like serve the song, it doesn't mean just play the thing that comes to mind. It's like being present and contributing what you can, even if it's in a register you wish you could transcend, or it's on an instrument that you barely know how to play. Sometimes that gives somebody else permission to do something that they didn't think, they weren't comfortable enough to do in that moment.
That's absolutely true. And talk about people surprising you. I've had a really, really long history. My closest friend outside my family with the drummer Jay Bellerose, and I've witnessed, chasing a song for a little bit. Maybe we played 4 or 5 takes, and it's all in range. It feels like it's in the room, the spirit's in the room. It's just about kind of, coaxing that bird to land on your arm, and then we call for another take. And I remember this one occasion, the next take goes by, Jay does not strike a single note. And get to the end of the take, and somebody asked him, was there a problem? He goes, oh no, just whatever was happening in that one didn't need anything from me. So for me, that was still Jay playing drums. He's protecting space. That's a choice. Mm-hmm. Whether he strikes a note or observes that, the rhythmic integrity is coming from somewhere else. And if I start marking any kind of time, it's going to defeat the way that time is already kind of floating through the room. And I rely so tremendously on musicians who are willing to, in a moment, pivot from, it's on range. People, I've been around people, it's like, I don't want to blow anybody else's take. Fuck it, you always play it again. Mm-hmm. It's not fragile. Mm-hmm. When it's in the room, it's not fragile. It's not about to escape you. It's not like if we don't get this one take, it's gone for. It can't possibly matter. It lands when it lands. But I wanted to ask you something. When you're producing, you're frequently also playing. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious about how you keep your aerial view as a producer while you're also, because for myself, it's really rare that I sing or play on anything I'm producing, because I think somebody in the room needs to maintain that posture of, I got to stand in for whatever audience this music may ever have. I just got to stand here hands free and be the one in the room to say, it did something to me. Mm-hmm. But I know a lot of producers who I admire tremendously who are also frequently playing and producing. And I wonder what that's like for you to have a mind toward your own investment in what you're contributing, and how you maintain that detached mind that needs to understand what everybody just played.
Well, my preferred method is to not be playing while the take is going down. It does compromise my ability to hear everything I would like to be hearing. You're listening in a different way. You're listening for, you're listening. You're trying to determine whether it requires your involvement or not. Mm-hmm. You're listening on that scale, and then if you feel that it does, you've got to do these okay, what do I say? What do I do? And if you don't have that going on, and you catch something that is inadequate, like on this song, compared to the last one, the singer is singing a lot quieter. and it's not exciting the microphone in the way that it can and it should. It needs to. You know, you'll reach over and you'll wait for a pause and you'll go up a click on the gain and try to do it in a way that doesn't disrupt or, you know, make a pop or something like that and distract anybody. And that's just a different, you're performing a different service to the song at that point. You're really trying to cultivate the ingredients of what's coming out you know, in real time as best you can. Like you said, sort of in preparation for the constant, like, great, it's getting better, let's do another one.
Yeah.
You know, and you just keep doing that until it stops getting better.
Yeah. And
then you go, okay, let's come off of it for a little while. Yeah. You know, let's talk about lunch.
Yeah.
You know, and it, no matter how different the record is, and no matter whether it's a solo artist or a band, whether I'm playing or I'm not playing, I think that's the common thread. Like, to some degree, every record is like that, and you work within people's, you know, preferences of whether they only like to do 3 takes, you know, and that's all you get, and they don't even tell you going in, this is who I am and what I like to do. It's still a little bit of that process of just like, and so you do that, right? And how funny also when sometimes you go and you try to correct it, and maybe you do get the microphone to sound better, but it doesn't mean that the performance is getting better from the singer.
Yeah.
Everybody else could be really getting their heads around the song by take 3, and the recording is better, you know, and the food comes out at the preferred temperature and it's right. But the difference is that there can be some intangible thing that a listener picks up on, or the artist picks up on in their first take. Or there's some dogma going on too, some like juju in there, just like, well, you know, that's the one.
That undefinable thing. I was producing a collaborative record between Elvis Costello and my great friend and mentor, Alan Toussaint. And it was the first day, and it was a short while after Katrina, you know, in New Orleans. Alan had lost everything, and we were working in Los Angeles. And there was a new song that Elvis and Alan had written together, and we'd been chasing it for a bit. And we played a take, and then we just, okay, I think we need to step away. And we went and ordered, food was there. And I slipped back in the control room at one point while people were eating. I thought I was alone, and I hit the tape machine and listened to the last take we'd played. And I didn't realize that Alan had followed me in the room and was standing behind me. And got to the end of listening, and he just said, well, it's right, but that's all it is. Mm-hmm. And I knew he was saying there's nothing wrong with it, but that thing that has to happen has not happened. Mm-hmm. And when it happens, even when it's like shot full of holes and, you know, maybe the ending fell apart completely, whatever, everybody in the room kind of knows, you know, when the seance has worked, you know, when a spirit has entered the room. It might be a different spirit than you thought you were conjuring, but a spirit nonetheless. And that thing that you just sort of accept that when it happens, we'll understand. And I might not be able to say why that one, except that I just can't stop listening to it. And we can fix whatever's, you know, whatever fell apart. But in essence, that's what we mean to do, is that. That's an incredible place to be, working with musicians who are, you know, willing to come together in the room in real time and not be thinking about self-expression, but being dedicated instead to discovery, which is why, and we could talk about this too, I don't ever do what people call pre-production. I've, you know, been kind of protecting myself from that for years. People who have an impulse to want to go into a rehearsal space somewhere and, you know, work out the arrangements and whatever, and then go to the studio later and kind of just read it into the public record, you know, in front of better microphones. Because invariably when that moment of discovery happens, when a song stands up and identifies its own character, no matter what anybody thought about what it was going to be or what we hoped it might be, that's the moment I want to record. Sometimes that's a first take, sometimes that's a fifth take. But there really is a moment when something else takes over, if people are of a shared mind who are working together and are willing to just be a part of that seance. There's a moment when the song takes over. And there's nothing for me as electrifying as when that happens. And that's the record for me. And I can't bear the thought of that revelation happening when we're not there to really receive it. Yeah.
Over the years, has your sense of what that take is, has that evolved? You know what I mean?
I think I do. Yeah. I mean, I think in my early production life, I was maybe trying to think more on behalf of the artist, like, you know, if it's Joan, like, how's Joan hearing this? You know, if I sense that maybe it's not landing for her, where do I think things need to shift to accommodate her? And the change that I recognize happening is I don't think about the artist, I think about the song. And it's like, are we serving it? I don't care if your voice cracked and you are concerned that maybe you sound not like the singer you like to think yourself being. It cannot matter to me if what happened is a drama that's really useful to us. And I spent a lot of my production life just trying to talk artists out of fixing things. Mm-hmm. It's like, look, if it's really a distraction, we can address it. There's nothing that can't be addressed, really. Even bleed all over, anything can be addressed in one way or another. But there's that intangible thing that we all want to feel kind of take over. And like I said, if someone's voice cracks and they go, oh, I need to fix that. I said, well, before you do, or I know, like, Mark Rebo will play something. I said, and that's not what you meant to play, but before we do anything about it, let's listen to what its function in the music is. It might just be that it just jars everybody out of complacency. And what an unbelievable gift that is. How many times we've needed that to happen? The song is going along and it just becomes like a flat, plane. And something's got to disrupt it. Something's got to represent the emotional progress of this song. And it frequently happens in some way that's not about the written composition or not necessarily about what anybody was about to happen, but some strange synergy of everybody meeting and trying to find their way into this song at the same time from whatever point of view they possess. And something happens that could not happen any other possible way. You don't get there building it track by track. And I'm not disparaging that as a way to work. It just doesn't, it's just not the clearest line for me to that indescribable but undeniable place where a song changes the course of the blood in your body. Because there's no goal beyond that. So I just use a lot of words to say, I just started listening to it and not thinking about them. Mm-hmm. And then I found it easier to be an advocate for what the song might be, no matter what the artist or any musician in the room, no matter what their expectation was for it, whatever their preformed idea was. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, yeah, we thought the song was that, but very quickly, it, in decided terms, said, no, I'm this character and I live over here and I dress like this. And if you want to walk with me, here's how. Mm.
It's interesting to get to listen to the reissues of records when they give you the unused takes of things. And as an audience member, what a thrill.
Oh yeah.
And as a record maker, what a treat to get some insight into why they chose the take that they chose.
Yeah.
And in some rare instances, there's that, like, wow, they picked the wrong one.
Yeah. Without question.
Yeah. And And I feel like sometimes when you're at odds with an artist and you're trying to talk them out of, as you said, smoothing out some of the idiosyncrasies that might be there, it's such a difficult place to be, because you never want to be on that side of an argument with an artist and their own work, trying to convince them of something or sway them of something, but that is what you're there to do.
That is.
By their own
and it's particularly
choosing.
tricky, don't you think? Because you and I are both, I think, artists first. That's how I entered the production world, and I think that's true for you. For me, artist is the last word. It's their record. It's not mine. That's how I got schooled as a producer. You invest yourself fully, but you also know that you're in service to someone else. So there's that idea of I honor you, the artist, as having the last word, except that you're wrong. What do you do with that? We have to keep those things in balance, because we are in fact being employed to challenge those, if we're just there to agree with whatever the artist is doing at any given moment, you're of no use to them, whatsoever. Being a loving advocate for the thing that couldn't be imagined is a big part of the job description.
Yeah, and then there's also that nagging thing where you go back to something, or I've had this experience. I go back to something I worked on years ago, and I hear it, and I go. At the time, I was like, "Oh man, I thought that sounded amazing." I listen to it now, and I'm like,
Yeah,
So like these opinions that are so strong in us are actually totally written in water that's flowing, and this thing that we're right about, and we are. we very soon thereafter we're not right anymore, because the song has changed. The song has a life of its own, and it's why you come back and you listen to something and you had a memory of sounding so good, and it could be your own project, it could be the Beatles. You listen to it and you go, God, in my mind it was like the drums were really big and there was like all this bottom end, and then you put it on, you just kind of go, it's kind of thin sounding, and think like thin is a bad word, but like it's part of what makes those records sound the way they do. And when you're mixing, you're never after thinness.
No, I never heard anybody say, can you thin that out a little bit?
No. So it is strange to have to rely on these senses that are kind of false, and instruments that are not calibrated to stand the test of time. It's fallible, but you also know the artist is operating under the same.
Yeah.
And so there's an equilibrium there. You can kind of, you're uniquely positioned to push back. You're like the jester, for royalty, and you could kind of push back and say, like, yes, it was good, but it's not as good as I've heard you do it.
Yeah.
There's a little manipulation going on that can feel icky, but it's necessary. And in the instances where I've been lucky enough to be the artist and be produced by somebody whose tastes I totally trust, it was such a relief. It was so wonderful. And yet it's something it's rare for me, because I am used to having the control.
Yeah.
I'm used to having the control, whether it's because we're recording in my environment and I'm able to help navigate, or it's flipped and I'm the artist and I'm working on my songs, and it's as much as they are opportunities to collaborate with my friends and my heroes, it's also still this one part of my life where I can exercise control. And that's important. I think that's part of what draws me to wanting to make a solo record every few years. It's like, it's somehow a balm to the thing that I spend most of my time doing, which is helping develop somebody else's music and collaborating with them.
That's very real. I mean, I got to a point where I realized, I produce records. It's a big part of my living, but I make my own records because I have to and because I want to. And that informs everything I do as a producer, even if it means something to a very small group of people. It's still how I get formed. But that idea of listening to things and that felt great in a moment and then it feels elusive later, like it's gone. I remember when I first met T-Bone Burnett, and he produced a record of mine in 1990, and it was live to 2-track tape. So it was mixed as it was performed. That was just the strategy. And I remember getting to the end of it and listening to a playback of the whole thing and T saying, Joey, how does it sound to you? And I remember saying, well, it sounds really good. I wonder what it'll sound like to me in 5 years. And he said, oh, you know the trick to this, by the way? When we leave this room, don't ever listen to this again. And everybody in the room laughed. And I knew he was being deadly serious in that if your expectation is about how this is going to live for you, then you're better off not coming back to it because you will get your heart smashed. But if you accept that music is always evolving and that records are not static, I mean, they evolve with us. I mean, I listen to records all the time that were recorded in the 30s and the 40s. I mean, every day of my life in some way. And it's conjuring this into real-time experience. It impacts the fabric of my day. Robert Johnson becomes a living specter in my room, and it's a bit of magic. I can hear a record that was recorded a month ago and it sounds completely inert to me. And yet Johnny Hodges always sound like a living man jumping out of a speaker cone. What the hell? How does this go on? But it goes on all the time. And things that I dismissed, arrogantly in my youth, I'll hear randomly now and be absolutely devastated by it. And I can be sorrowful about how many years I wasted, or I can just say, this found me exactly when it needed to find me, somehow, because it's a weather system. Put music on it, music is only music when it's in the air. Everything else is just a suggestion of the possibility. It's a roadmap versus the actual road. But when music is in the air, it becomes a weather system, and it changes everything in the way that we know and ways that we don't know. And I find that endlessly affirming to the process we're talking about, because it doesn't all just end with that day that you make a final decision about it. Those records you're talking about listening to, and now they sound a little flat and not as animated. It probably has a lot to do with where we are as listeners in that moment, too. Like I can return to records I worked on, and if I'm having a day where I'm kind of dragging and feeling like I've never been able to get my back leg over the fence in this racket that I've invested myself in, I can be low about my station. I'm not proud to tell you. And that can impact the way that I evaluate what I've worked on, because I'm struggling with my own place in it all, in my own life, and in my reconciling my ambitions towards my reality. And that's impactful on how I evaluate anything. So I can approach that same music later and be completely just overwhelmed by it. And it's not about me anymore at all, even if I was involved. It has become something of its own. And I'm just as likely to be moved by it, truth be told, as anybody who might encounter it. And part of that is about letting go of ego, but a part of it is really perfectly sating to the ego, because I don't have to take credit for that, I mean, Harry Truman said, it's amazing what can be accomplished when you're not worried about who's getting credit for it. And I find that, and I kind of only work with musicians at this point in my life who are that generous that nobody's really just trying to make a mark. Nobody's trying to show off their prowess. Everybody's just trying to feed wood into a fire until it takes. And I find that overwhelmingly life affirming, not just in regard to my musical life, but in regard to the whole of my life.
Also, those records that we listen to, we're going like, oh, that doesn't sound half as good as I remembered it. Somebody else is listening to it at the same time, going, wow, you know, why does that sound as good as it does?
Yeah.
Like is everybody wrong? Is everybody right about?
Well, some people are distracted that Lightning Hopkins' B string is out, and I'm going, do you think it could be better? You know, if you could reach your hand into the frame and just give it no. He's coming for blood. I mean, his B string got not one thing to do with it ultimately, but we can get hung up on those things as record makers because we care and we have a responsibility to get it in as best a shape as it can be as it moves away from us, because that's the ultimate goal. It has to walk out into the world and speak its own truth, whatever that is. And I got plenty enough ego, but my ego is perfectly sated if a song leaves me and there's no trace of me left. I never wanted as a producer to have a sound. I don't want anybody to, listen to what I did with Mavis and say, oh, listen to how clever he was to do. Then I've completely blown it. I just want people to hear it and just go, God, Mavis, she's everything. Mm-hmm. And then I feel, completely validated.
I think there's a lot of craft in being able to do that on a subliminal way. There's so many steps in the process that can chip away at, going back to the food analogy, there are certain types of food that don't matter. It doesn't matter whether you have it hot and fresh on the table or out of the fridge the next day. There's actually some kinds of food that is better.
Yeah.
Right? The next day. But as producers of a recording, there are certain decisions you have to make that ultimately impact the temperature of the food, and that needs to be decided upon. And as a listener and a maker of music, the best frame of mind to be in is one where that is completely out of the frame. Mm-hmm. As the producer, you take on that responsibility so that an artist doesn't have to be thinking about that.
Right.
Ever, while they're doing the take or after it's done and mixing's happening or overdubs, whatever. It's just like let them keep thinking about everything else. And this stuff we've been talking about, like being the kind of navigating through different takes and choosing the best moments. A lot of artists have their own strong opinions about that too. And when they do, what is it necessary to present your own opinion, or is it better to let the artist kind of, parse that out? If you can take on all of those non-creative responsibilities and help the finished product do that thing exactly as you mentioned, where somebody listens to it and just goes, I feel like I'm in the room with this music. I'm transported to the place where it's happening. Right. That's the magic, and why conversations and seemingly endless conversations about seemingly pointless things like gear keep happening.
Yeah.
Like we know it's lame. We know it's embarrassing, yeah. But it's fun because the idea of music, even before it's created, also has its own kind of spell, its own weather patterns. You know,
Beautifully put.
it has an engine of its own where it's like kind of, you know, I'm here, you know, I'm tapping on the shell from the inside, and I think having that enthusiasm for as long as you can and stoking it and trying to be respectful of it and following it is what I've witnessed in a lot of these people that have had long careers and that are just inspiring people, you know, that I look up to. You're in that class. I mean, it's just something I hope as I continue to work in music, it keeps evolving, and I get to be around it, because it's just the greatest. It's the most inspiring thing about all of this.
Yeah, it's an authentic high.
Yeah,
It's powerful. I don't know how we're doing on time. Oh,
here we are.
I hope you had no questions. I hope we've answered them all.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your attention.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Jack. Hey, thank you. I enjoyed it a lot.
All right, that was Blake Mills and Joe Henry, two of the greatest singer-songwriters and producers under the sun, talking to each other at the 2024 Fretboard Summit right after they co-headlined. It's an amazing thing. Thanks as always for tuning in. We'll see you next week.